Hello, my friends. It's Indiana Holmes, and it's story time again. And tonight we begin a new book. The book is titled A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. And so we begin. Chapter 1. The beginning of the mystery. The history upon which I am now embarking abounds in incidents so amazing that as I look back on them, something approaching to skepticism contends with my vivid recollections and makes me feel almost apologetic in laying them before the reader. Some of them, indeed, are so out of character with the workday life in which they happened that they will appear almost incredible, but none is more fraught with mystery than the experience that befell me on a certain September night in the last year of my studentship and ushered in the rest of the astounding sequence. It was just past 11 o'clock when I let myself out of my lodgings at Gospel Oak. A dark night, cloudy and warm, rather inclined to rain, but despite the rather unfavorable aspect of the weather, I turned my steps away from the town, walking briskly up the Highgate Road, presently turned into Millfield Lane. This was my favorite walk, and the pretty winding lane, meandering so pleasantly from Lower Highgate to Heights of Hampstead, was familiar to me under all its aspects. On sweet summer mornings, when the cuckoos called from the depths of Kenwood, when the path was spangled with golden sunlight, and saucy squirrels played hide and seek in the shadows under the elms, though the place was within earshot of Westminster and within sight of the dome of St. Paul's, on winter days when the heath wore its mantle of white and the ring of gliding steel came up from the skaters on the pond below, on August evenings when I would come suddenly on sequestered lovers to our mutual embarrassment and hurry by with ill-feigned unconsciousness, I knew all of its phases and loved them all. Even its name was delightful, carrying the mind back to those more rustic days when wits foregathered at Oak Flask Tavern, and John Constable tramped through this very lane with his color box slung over his shoulder. It was very dark after I had passed the lamp at the entrance to the lane, very silent and solitary too. Not a soul was stirring at this hour, for the last of the lovers had long since gone home, and the place was a little frequented even in the daytime. The elms brooded over the road, shrouding it in shadows of palpable black, and their leaves whispered secretly in the soft night breeze. But the darkness, the quiet, and the solitude were restful after the long hours of study and the glare of the printed page, and I strolled on past the ghostly pond and the little thatched cottage, now wrapped in silence and darkness, with a certain wistful regret that I must soon look my last on for them. For I had now passed all my examinations, but the final fellowship, and must soon be starting my professional career in earnest. Presently a light rain began to fall. Foreseeing that I should have to curtail my walk, I stepped forward more briskly, and passing between the posts, entered the narrowest and most secluded part of the lane. But now the rain suddenly increased, and a squall of wind drove it athwart the path. I drew up in the shelter of one of the tall oak fences by which the lane is here enclosed, and waited for the shower to pass. And as I stood with my back to the fence, pensively filling my pipe, I became for the first time sensible of the utter solitude of the place. I looked about me and listened. The lane was darker here than elsewhere, a mere trench between the high fences. I could dimly see the posts at the entrance, and a group of large elms overshadowing them. In the other direction where the lane doubled sharply upon itself, was absolute, inky blackness, save where a faint glimmer from the wet ground showed the corner of the fence, and a projecting stump or tree root jutting out from the corner and looking curiously like a human foot with toes pointed upwards. The rain fell steadily with a soft, continuous murmur. The leaves of the elms whispered together and answered the falling rain. The Scotch pines above my head stirred in the breeze with a sound like the surge of a distant sea. The voices of nature hushed and solemn, obviously of man like voices of the wilderness, and over all, through all, a profound enveloping silence. I drew up closer to the fence and shivered slightly, for the night was growing chill. It seemed a little lighter now in the narrow, trench-like lane, not that the sky was less murky, but because the ground was now flooded with water. The posts stood out less vaguely against the black background of wet road, and the odd-looking stump by the corner was almost distinct. And again it struck me as looking curiously like a foot, a booted foot, with a toe pointing upwards. The chime of the church clock sounded across the heath. A human voice, this, penetrating the desolate silence. Then, after an interval, the solemn boom of Big Ben came up faintly from the sleeping city. Midnight, and time for me to go home. It was of no use to wait for the rain to cease. There was no passing shower, but a steady drizzle that might last till morning. I relit my pipe, turned up my collar, and prepared to plunge into the rain. And as I stepped out, the queer-looking stump caught my eye once more. It was singularly like a foot, and it was odd, too, that I had never noticed it before in my many rambles through the lane. A sudden childish curiosity impelled me to see what it really was before I went. The next moment I was striding sharply up the sodden path. Of course, I expected the illusion to vanish as I approached, but it did not. The resemblance increased as I drew nearer, and I hurried forward with something more than curiosity. It was a foot. I realized it with a shock while I was some paces away, and as I reached the corner, I came upon the body of a man lying in the shape of a sharp turn of the path, and the limp, sprawling posture, with one leg doubled under, told its tale at a glance. I laid my finger on his wrist. It was clammy and cold, and not a vestige of a pulse could I detect. I struck a wax match and held it to his face. The eyes were wide open and filmy, staring straight up into the reeking sky. The dilated pupils were insensitive to the glare of the match, the eyeballs insensitive to the touch of my finger. Beyond all doubt, the man was dead. But how had he died? Had he simply fallen dead from some natural cause, or had he been murdered? There was no obvious injury and no sign of blood. All that momentary glimmer of the match showed was that his clothes were shiny with the wet, a condition that might easily, in the weak light, mask a considerable amount of bleeding. When the match went out, I stood for some moments looking down on the prostrate figure as it lay with the rain beating down on the upturned face, professional interest contending with natural awe of the tragic presence. The former prompted me to ascertain without delay the cause of death, and, indeed, I was about to make a more thorough search for some injury or wound when something whispered to me that it is not well to be alone at midnight in a solitary place with a dead man, perchance a murdered man. Had there been any sign of life, my duty would have been clear. As it was, I must act for the best with due regard to my own safety, and, reaching this conclusion, I turned away. With that last glance, a motionless figure and set forth homeward at a rapid pace. As I turned out Millfield Lane into Highgate Rise, I perceived a policeman on the opposite side of the road standing under a tree where the light from a lamp fell on a shining tarpaulin cape. I crossed the road, and as he civilly touched his helmet, I said, "I am afraid there is something wrong up the lane, Constable. I have just seen the body of a man lying on the pathway." The constable woke up very completely. "Do you mean a dead man, sir?" he asked. "Yes, he is undoubtedly dead," I replied. "Whereabouts did you see the body?" inquired the constable. "In the narrow part of the lane, just by the stables of the Mansfield house." "That's some distance from here," said the constable. "You had better come with me and report at the station." "You're sure the man is dead, sir?" "Yes, I have no doubt about it. I am a medical man," I added with some pride. I had been a medical man about 3 months, and the sensation was still a novel one. "Oh, are you, sir?" said the officer, with a glance at my half-fledged countenance. "Then I suppose you examined the body." "Sufficiently to make sure the man was dead, but I did not stay to ascertain the cause of death." "No, sir, quite so. We can find that out later." As we talked, the constable swung along down the hill without hurry, but at a pace that gave me very ample exercise, and I caught his eye from time to time, traveling over my person with obvious professional interest. When we had nearly reached the bottom of the hill, there appeared suddenly on the wet road ahead a couple of figures in waterproof capes. "Ha!" said the constable. "This is fortunate. Here is the inspector and the sergeant. That will save us the walk to the station." He accosted the officers as he approached and briefly related what I had told him. "You are sure the man was dead, sir?" said the inspector, scrutinizing me narrowly. "But we needn't stay here to discuss that. You run down, sergeant, and get a stretcher, and bring it along as quickly as you can. I must trouble you, sir, to come with me and show me where the body is. Lend the gentleman your cape, sergeant. You can get another at the station." I accepted the stout man's cape thankfully, for the rain still fell steadily, persistently, and set forth with the inspector to retrace my steps. And as we splashed along through the deep gloom of the lane, the officer plied me with judicious questions. "How long did you think the man had been dead?" he asked. "Not long, I should think. The body was still quite limp." "You didn't see any marks of violence?" "No, there were no obvious injuries." "Which way were you going when you came on the body?" "The way we are going now, and of course I came straight back." "Did you meet or see anyone in the lane?" "Not a soul," I answered. He considered my answers for some time, and then came the question that I had been expecting. "How came you to be in the lane at this time of the night?" "I was taking a walk," I replied, "as I do nearly every night. I usually finish my evenings reading about 11, and then have some supper and take a walk before going to bed. And I take my walk most commonly in Millfield Lane. Some of your men must remember having met me." This explanation seemed to satisfy him, for he pursued the subject no farther, and we trudged on for a while in silence. At length, as we passed through the posts into the narrow part of the lane, the inspector asked, "We're nearly there, aren't we?" "Yes," I replied. "The body is lying in the bin just ahead." I peered into the darkness in search of the foot that had first attracted my notice, but there was none yet to distinguish it, nor, to my surprise, could I make out as we approached more nearly, and when we reached the corner I stopped short in utter amazement. The body had vanished. "What's the matter?" asked the inspector. "I thought this was the place you meant." "So it is," I answered. "This is the place where the body was lying, here across the path with one foot projecting round the corner. Someone must have carried it away." The inspector looked at me sharply for a moment. "Well, it isn't here now," said he, "and if it has been taken away, it must have been taken along towards Hampstead Lane. We'd better go see." Without waiting for a reply, we started off along the lane as Smart doubled, and I followed. We pursued the windings of the lane until we emerged into the road by the lodge gates, without discovering any traces of the missing corpse or meeting any person, and then we turned back and retraced our steps, and as we once more approached the crook in the lane where I had seen the body, we heard a quick, measured tramp. "Here comes the sergeant with the stretcher," observed the inspector, "and he might have saved himself the trouble." Once more the officer glanced at me sharply, and this time with unmistakable suspicion. "There is no body here, Robson," he said, as the sergeant came up, accompanied by 2 constables carrying a stretcher. "It seems to have disappeared." "Disappeared!" exclaimed the sergeant, bestowing on me a look of extreme disfavor. "That's a rum go, sir. How could it have disappeared?" "Ah, that's the question," said the inspector. "And another question is, was it ever here? Are you prepared to make a sworn statement on the subject, sir?" "Certainly I am," I replied. "Then," said the inspector, "we will take it that there was a body here. Put down that stretcher. There is a gap in the fence farther along. We will get through there and search the meadow." The bearers stood on the stretcher up against a tree and proceeded up the lane to the place where the observant inspector had noticed the opening in the fence. The gravel, though sodden with wet, took but the faintest impressions of our feet that trod in it, and though the sergeant and the 2 constables threw the combined light of their lanterns on the ground, we were only able to make out very faintly the occasional traces of our own footsteps. We scrutinized the break in the fence and the earth around with utmost minuteness, but there could detect no sign of anyone having passed through. The short turf of the meadow, on which I had seen sheep grazing in the daytime, was not calculated to yield traces of anyone passing over it, and no traces of any kind were discoverable. When we had searched the meadow thoroughly and without result, we came back into the lane and followed its devious course to the Kissing Gate at Hampstead Lane entrance, and still there was no sign of anything unusual. True, there were obscure footprints in the soft gravel by the turnstile, but they told us nothing. We could not even be sure that they had not been made by our own selves on our previous visit. In short, the net result of our investigations was that the body had vanished and left no trace. "It's a very extraordinary affair," said the inspector in a tone of deep discontent as we walked back. "The body of the full-grown man isn't the sort of thing that you can put in your pocket and stroll off with without being noticed, even at midnight. Are you perfectly sure the man was really dead and not in a faint?" "I feel no doubt whatsoever that he was dead," I replied. "With all respect to you, sir," said the sergeant, "I think you must be mistaken. I think the man must have been in a dead faint, and after you came away the rain must have revived him, so that he was able to get up and walk away." "I don't think so," I said, though with less conviction, for after it was not absolutely impossible that I should have been mistaken, since I had discovered no mortal injury, and the sergeant's suggestion was an eminently reasonable one. "What sized man was he?" the inspector asked. "That I couldn't say," I answered. "It was not easy to judge the height of the man when he was lying down, and the light was excessively dim. But I should say he was not a tall man, and rather slight in build. Could you give us any description of him?" "He was an elderly man, about 60, I should think, and he appeared to be a clergyman or a priest, for he wore a Roman collar around with a narrow dark stripe in the front. He was clean shaven, and I think wore a clerical suit of black. A tall hat was lying on the ground close by, and a walking stick, which looked like a malacca, but I couldn't see it very well, and he had fallen on it, and most of it was hidden." "And you saw all this by the light of one wax match?" said the inspector. "You pretty much made good use of your eyes, sir." "A man isn't much use in my profession if he doesn't," I replied rather stiffly. "No, that's true," the inspector agreed. "Well, I must ask you to give us the full particulars at the station, and we shall see if anything fresh turns up. I'm sorry to keep you hanging about in the wet, but it can't be helped." "Of course it can't," I said, and we trudged on in silence until we reached the station, which looked quite cheerful and homelike despite the grim blue lamp above the doorway. "Well, doctor," said the inspector, when he had read over my statement and had affixed my signature, "if anything turns up, you'll hear from us, but I doubt if we shall hear anything more of this. Dead or alive, the man seems to have vanished completely. Perhaps the sergeant's right after all, and your dead man's at this moment comfortably tucked up in his bed. Good night." "Good night, doctor, and thank you for all the trouble you have taken." By the time I had reached my lodgings, I was tired out and miserably cold. So cold, I was fain to brew myself a jorum of hot grog in my shaving pot. As a natural result, I fell fast asleep as soon as I got into bed and slept until the autumn sunshine poured in through the slats of the Venetian blinds. Chapter 2. The Finding of the Reliquary. I awoke the following morning to a dim consciousness of something unusual, and as my wits returned with the rapidity that is natural to the young and healthy, the surprising events of the previous night reconstituted themselves and once more set a-going the train of speculation. Vividly, I saw with my mind's eye the motionless figure lying limp and inert with a pitiless rain beating down on it, the fixed pupils, the insensitive eyeballs, the pulseless wrist, and the sprawling posture. And again I saw the streaming path, void of its dreadful burden. The suspicious inspector, the incredulous sergeant, and the unanswerable questions formulated themselves anew. Had I, after all, mistaken a living man for a dead man? It was, in the highest degree, improbable, and yet it was not impossible. Or had the body been spirited away without leaving a trace? That was the high and highly improbable, and yet not quite impossible. The two contending improbabilities canceled one another. Each was unlikely as the other. I turned the problem over again and again as I shaved and took my bath. I pondered it over a late and leisurely breakfast, but no conclusion emerged from these reflections. The man, living or dead, had been lying motionless in the lane all the time that I was sheltering, and probably for some time before. In the interval of my absence, he had vanished. These were actual facts, despite the open incredulity of the police. How had he come there? What had occasioned his death or insensibility? How had he disappeared? And whither he had gone were questions to which no answer seemed possible. The fatigues of the previous night had left me somewhat indolent. There was no occasion for me to go to the hospital today. It was vacation time. The school was closed, the teaching staff were mostly away, and there was little doing in the wards. I decided to take a holiday and spend a quiet day rambling about the heath, and having formed this resolution, I filled my pipe, slipped a sketchbook in my pocket, and set forth. Automatically, my feet turned towards Millfield Lane. It was, as I have said, my usual walk, and on this morning, with last night's recollections fresh in my mind, it was natural that I should take my way thither. Very different was the aspect of the lane this morning from that which I had last looked upon. The gloom and the desolation of the night had given place to the golden sunshine of a lovely autumn day. The elms, clothed already in the sober livery of the waning year, sighed with pensive reminiscence of the summer that was gone. The ponds repeated the warm blue of the sky, and the lane itself was a vista of flickering sunlight and cool, reposeful shadow. The narrow continuation beyond the posts was wrapped, as always, in a somber shade, save where a gleam of yellow light streamed through a chink between the boards of the fence. I made my way straight to the spot where the body had lain and stooped over it, examining each pebble with the closest scrutiny. But not a trace remained. The hard gravel soil retained no impression either of the body or even of our footsteps, and as for the stain of blood, if there had ever been any, it would have been immediately removed by the falling rain. For the ground here had a quite appreciable slope, and must have been covered last night by a considerable flowing stream. I went on to the break in the fence. It was on the right-hand side of the path, and was at once discouraged by the aspect of the ground, for even our rough tramplings had left hardly a trace behind. After an aimless walk across the meadow, I now occupied a flock of sheep. I returned to the lane and walked slowly back past the place where I had sheltered from the rain, and then it was that I discovered the first hint of any clue to the mystery. I had retraced my steps some little distance past the spot where I had seen the body, when my eye was attracted by a darkish streak on the upper part of the high fence. It was quite faint and not at all noticeable on the weather-stained oak, but it chanced to catch my eye, and I stopped to examine it. The fence which bore it was opposite one to that in which the break occurred, and since I had sheltered under it, the side of which looked outwards towards the lane must have been the lee side, and thus less exposed to the rain. I looked at the stain attentively. It extended from the top of the fence, which was about 7 feet high, halfway to the ground, fading away gradually in all directions. The color was a dull brown, and the appearance very much that of blood which had run down a wet surface. The board which bore the stain was traversed by a vertical crack near one edge, so that I was able to break off a small piece without much difficulty, and on examining that portion of the detached piece which had formed the side of the crack, I found it covered with a brownish red, shiny substance, which I felt little doubt was dried blood, here protected by the crack and so less altered by contact with water. Naturally, my next proceeding was to scrutinize very carefully the ground immediately beneath the stain. At the foot of the fence, a few tussocks of grass and clumps of undergrown weeds struggled for life in the deep shade. The latter certainly had, on close examination, the appearance of having been trodden on, though it was not very evident. But while I was considering an undoubted bruise on the stalk of a little dead nettle, my eye caught the glint of some bright object among the leaves. I picked it out eagerly and held it up to look at it, and a very curious object it was, evidently an article of jewelry of some kind, but quite unlike anything I had ever seen before. It appeared to be a little elongated gold case with 8 sides and terminating at either end in a blunt octagonal pyramid with a tiny ring at its apex, so that it seemed to have been part of a necklace. Of the 8 flat sides, 6 were ornamented with sunk quatrefoils, 4 on each side. The other 2 were plain, except that each had a row of letters engraved on it, A, M, D, G on one side, and S, V, D, P on the other. There was no hallmark, and as far as I could see, no means of opening the little case. It seemed to have been suspended by a thin silk cord, a portion of which remained attached to one ring and showed a frayed end where it had been broken or chafed through. I wrapped a little object and detached fragment of the fence in my handkerchief, for I had broken off the latter with the idea of testing it chemically for blood pigment, and then resumed my investigations. The appearances suggested that the body had lifted or had been lifted over the fence, and the question arose, what was on the other side? I listened attentively for a few seconds, and then, hearing no sound of footsteps, I grasped the top of the fence, gave a good spearing and a hoisting, and hoisted myself up, sat astride, and looked about me. The fence skirted the margin of the small lake, much overgrown with weeds, amidst which I could see a couple of water hens making off in alarm at my appearance, and beyond the lake rose the dark mass of Ken Wood. The ground between the fence and the lake was covered with high, reedy grass, which immediately below my perch bore very distinct impressions of feet, and an equally distinct set of tracks which led away towards the wood, or from the wood to the fence. It was impossible to say which, but in any case, as there were no other tracks, it was certain that the person who made them had climbed over the fence. I dropped down on the grass, and having examined the ground attentively, without discovering anything fresh, set off to follow the tracks. For some distance they continued through high grass in which the impressions were very distinct. Then they entered the wood, and here also, in the soft humus, lightly sprinkled with fallen leaves, the footprints were deep and easy to follow. But presently they struck a path, and as they did not reappear on the farther side, it was evident that the unknown person had proceeded along it. The path was an old one, well made of hard gravel, and where it passed through the deeper shade of the wood was covered with velvety moss and gray-green lichen, on which I made out with some difficulty the imprints of feet. But these were no longer distinct. They did not form a connected track, nor was it possible to distinguish them from the footprints of the other persons who might have passed along the path. Even these I soon lost, where I had halted irresolutely under a noble beech that rose from the fantastic coil of roots, and was considering how, if at all, I should next proceed. When then appeared round a curve of the path a man in cord breeches and gaiters, evidently a keeper. He touched his hat civilly and ventured to inquire my business. "I'm afraid I have no business here at all," I replied, for I did not think it expedient to tell him what I had brought with me into the wood. "I suppose I am trespassing." "Well, sir, it is private property," he rejoined, "and being so near London, we have to be rather particular. Perhaps you would like me to show you the way out to the heath." I accepted his offer with many thanks for his courteous method of ejecting a trespasser, and we walked together through the beautiful woodland until the path terminated at the rustic turnstile. "That will be your way, sir," he said, as he let me out, indicating a track that led down to the Vale of Heath, or the Vale of Health. I thanked him once more, and then asked, "Is that a private house, or does it belong to your estate?" I pointed to a small house or large cottage that stood within the fenced enclosure, not far from the edge of the wood. "That, sir," he replied, "was formerly a keeper's lodge. It is now let for short term to an artist gentleman who is making some pictures of the heath. But I expect it will be pulled down before long, as there is some talk of the country council taking over that piece of land to add to the public grounds. Good morning, sir." And the keeper, with a parting salute, turned back into the wood. As I took my way homeward, by Highgate Ponds, I meditated on the relation of my new discoveries to the mystery of the preceding night. It was a strange affair, and sinister withal, that the tracks led from the lane to the wood and not from the wood to the lane. I felt firmly convinced, and equally so, that the body from the unknown priest or clergyman had undoubtedly been spirited away, but whither it had been carried, presumably to some sequestered spot in the wood, and what had a better hiding place could be found. There, buried in the soft leaf mold, it might lie undisturbed for centuries, covered only the deeper as each succeeding autumn shed its russet burden on the unknown grave. And what, I wondered, was the connection between this mysterious tragedy and the queer little object that I had picked up? Perhaps there was none. Its presence at that particular spot might be nothing but coincidence. I took it from my handkerchief and examined it afresh. It was a very curious object. As to its use or meaning, I could only form vague surmises. Perhaps it was some kind of locket, enclosing a wisp of hair, and a hair, perhaps, as some dead child or wife or husband or even lover. It was impossible to say. Of course, this question could be settled by taking it to pieces, but it was loath to injure and pretty little bauble. Besides, it was not mine. In fact, I felt that I ought to notify publicity that I had found it, though the circumstances did not make this very advisable. But if it had any connection with the tragedy, what was the nature of that connection? Had it dropped from the dead man or from the murderer I assumed the other man to be? Either was equally possible, though the two possibilities had different values. Then the question arose as to what course I should pursue. Clearly, it would be my duty to inform the police of the mark on the fence and the tracks through the grass, but I should hand over the mysterious trinket to them. It seems the correct thing to do, and yet there might, after all, be no connection between the crime. In the end, I left the matter to be decided by the attitude of the police themselves. I called at the station on my way home and furnished the inspector with my account of my discoveries, of which he made a careful note, assuring me that the affair should be looked into. But his manner expressed frank disbelief, and was even a trifle hostile, and his emphatic request that I would abstain from mentioning the matter to anyone left me in no doubt that he regarded both my communications as wild delusions, if not a deliberate hoax. Consequently, though frequently I reproached myself afterwards with the omission, I said nothing about the trinket, and when I left the station, I carried it in my pocket. No communication on the subject of this mysterious affair ever reached me from the police. That they did actually make some perfunctory investigations, I learned later, as will appear in this narrative, but they gave no publicity to the affair, and they sought no further information from me. For my own part, I could naturally never forget so strange an experience, but time and the multitudinous of interests of my opening life tended to push it farther into the background of memory, and there it might have been and might have remained forever had not a subsequent events drawn it once more from its obscurity. Okay, my friends, that was chapters 1 and 2 of A Silent Witness. I need to cut tonight a little bit short because I got home a little bit late from Disneyland, and I have to eat some dinner before I head off to the theater tonight. So I hope you're enjoying the beginning of this story. We now know that a man walking on his way home from the university where he was a student has found a dead body, told the police about it, and then returned to find the body missing. All very mysterious. We will continue with this mystery on Monday night at 6 p.m. Have a good weekend, everyone. Love to you all. This has been Indiana Holmes with Storytime. Good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.